Welcome to Spokane Talks. I'm Ryan McNeice. We're here on location in Missoula, Montana. Thank you for your viewership of our news, views, and conversation. Check out all of our episodes at SpokaneTalksMedia.com. John N Maclean, an award-winning author and journalist, has written about wildland fire for more than 2 decades. His fifth and latest book is River of Fire, The Rattlesnake Fire and the Mission Boys. Others include Fire on the Mountain, The True Story of the South Canyon Fire, and the Esperanza Fire. Maclean was, for 30 years, a reporter, writer, and editor for the Chicago Tribune, most of that time as a Washington correspondent. He was one of the Kissinger 14, the group of media who regularly traveled with Secretary of State Henry Kissinger during the era of shuttle diplomacy.
See you tomorrow night, and thanks again for taking care of the painting.
I got this.
Bye.
Weekends are made for painting. Let the experts at Rada Paint take care of you.
Hi. This looks amazing.
Rada Paint, over 80 years of quality, tradition, and trust. Find it in every can.
The following is sponsored by our friends and community supporters at McNeice Wheeler Attorneys. McNeice Wheeler is a boutique law firm in Spokane, handling matters in both Washington and Idaho. Areas of law include business law, wills, trusts and estates, family law, personal injury and wrongful death, and real estate matters. For your full-service legal needs, contact McNeice Wheeler Attorneys.
Ponderosa Republican Women is a club with members that come from every part of Spokane County. Although they differ in age, occupation, ethnic background, and cultural heritage, these women and many men stand together to promote government based on conservative principles, discover lifelong friendships, meet elected officials and candidates, hear challenging speakers, receive campaign training, and learn about the electoral process. Our meetings take place on the second Thursday of every month. Follow Ponderosa Republican Women on Facebook for more information.
Welcome to the show. I'm Ryan McNeice, and what a pleasure to be here in Missoula, Montana with John Maclean, award-winning writer and journalist, reporter. Spent 30 years with the Chicago Tribune as a foreign correspondent. And over the last 30 years has written 5 books on wildland forest fires, essentially cornering the market on the humanity and the experiences involved in not only fighting the wildfires, but in the tragedies that have occurred over the years, and has provided through those works an opportunity for those families to understand the experience and potentially learn lessons in moving forward. Thank you so much for allowing us to take the opportunity to chat with you.
Thanks for coming over and being here.
Right now you have a new book coming out.
I do.
Tell us about that book.
The book is called River of Fire, The Rattlesnake Fire and the Mission Boys. And basically, I've worked on it for about 20 years. I wrote it originally as a story of about 100 pages in a book of stories. And there was no general theme tying the stories together, as my editor told me at the time.
Brutally honest
well,
at the time.
Well, he was right. But the Rattlesnake Fire, which happened in 1953, took the lives of 15 firefighters, 14 members of a crew who happened to be missionaries.
Yeah, the Mission Boys, they call them.
Mission Boys. They had a training camp nearby, and they were a regular fire crew. And the Forest Service loved them because they were always on time, they didn't steal, they were clean, they worked hard, and were happy doing what they were doing. So they were often the first ones called out. So I wrote that story. It came out in 2003. And at the time, the site of the Rattlesnake Fire was a mess.
Right.
It was dirty, and it was off the grid. They'd put a new road in, and the old road was about the way it would have been in 1953, when a lot of logging trucks used it and ripped it up. But after the book came out, and not just because of the book,
sure,
for a lot of reasons, that whole site was recaptured. And the old fire lines were opened up, crosses were put in where the 15 men fell. A beautiful memorial was put up there. So people would find out about it who didn't know about it and go there. This would be relatives of men who died. The fallen were uncles, or in one case a father. And they would recapture the past and As one woman said, I found my father and lost him again on the same day. And I kept adding these things to the story.
That's the humanity, though, that I think you've done throughout your 5 books. And I want to quote, I believe over the last 25 years, it was argued that you are the court of last resort for families and survivors that potentially have inadequate investigations. And not so much the inadequate investigations, but rather an opportunity to bring humanity to the families and the fallen.
I think that's very true, because in the case of the Rattlesnake Fire, we tested the fire investigation. By we, it was a group that included me, but more than 30 California firefighters put together for the book. And we went back and did timing and pacing and all the rest, took the fire report and said, is this thing good or not? And it was good.
Right.
So it was not an inadequate report at all. It was a very good one. And I've found many inadequate reports.
Sure.
That was not
that
one
wasn't one of them.
So I kept adding these things. Sometimes I would put the manuscript aside for 2 or 3 years, and I've done a lot of other books in the meantime. But beginning this year, my longtime editor, Kelly Anderson, called me and said, look, John, if you're going to pop this thing again and bring it back into print, you better do it this year, because I'm getting old. And
if we're going to do this, we better do this.
She was gracious enough to say, and by the way, so are you. And so we got busy. And at that point, the redo of the story got transformed. Kelly got a hold of a woman named Kari Greer, who is a noted wildland fire photographer. She had a wonderful show here in Missoula earlier this year, and her photographs, she's been doing it for 20 years on fires as a paid operator. And her photographs are high art. I mean, they're just wonderful stuff. And she took 2 trips to the site of the Rattlesnake Fire and got in touch with 3 of the former superintendents of the Mendocino Hotshots. And they got her into the facts of the fire and the lore of the fire and so on. She really got into it. And Kelly and I looked at the product and said, you know, we've got way too much here for a black and white book, but let's do our best on the black and white. So we put in a photo gallery.
That I think is very helpful in understanding the geography, and as you're reading through the story, I was oftentimes going back to figure out and pinpoint where the individuals were.
I'm glad to hear that, because the people, you and certainly the fire community, love maps.
Absolutely.
You say something was, they walked 10 yards and fell off a cliff. They want to know where that happened.
Where the cliff is.
Let's see it put in context. I found the arsonist who started the Rattlesnake Fire.
Got another interesting piece that you don't see very often, and I want you to elaborate on this, is your recent interviews with the individual that actually started the fire. That's unique that's a part of the book.
Yes, I found the arsonist who started the Rattlesnake Fire. He had been arrested and confessed within the first week after the fire. He wasn't a malicious criminal. That sounds odd, but he was trying to start a job fire. His father was a very well-respected Forest Service engineer. He was kind of a mope. Been in the Navy in World War II. He'd been in the Pacific, actually.
Right.
On some pretty big campaigns.
Yep.
Okinawa and others. And he was a fine outdoorsman, but he got heavily in debt, bought a fancy car, couldn't hold a job. His wife had left him. He was driving around trying to find a job at a logging company. They wouldn't take him. But he never explained himself. Ryan, he'd get up in court and he'd say, are you guilty of this? Yes. And that was about it, you know.
But why? Yeah.
Why did you do this? I mean, job fire begins to explain it, but what was going on in your head? What were you thinking about? So he was hard to find. Old fire, where was he? I had no idea. His name was spelled P-A-T-T-O-N, Patton, in news accounts and in court documents. Hey,
spelled it wrong.
Hey,
yeah,
they got it wrong. And it led me and others astray. So I was in the area in Willows, California one night doing research. And I thought, you know, I started in this business as a reporter. Why don't I look at a phone book here where you got a local phone book? So I did, and there's Stan, P-A-T-T-A-N. Turns out they're an Italian family, Patani, and they dropped the I. And there's a telephone number. So I dialed it.
I wonder if he picks up.
I didn't have a plan, and the guy picked
What
it
if
up
he
and
picks
said
up?
hello, and I
Yeah.
said, hello. I'm looking for Phil Patton's son.
What year was this?
This would have been about 2000.
Okay.
And Phil Patton was his father, and he'd always lived in Phil's shadow. Go into a bar and say, hey, Phil Patton's son just walked in here. Have a beer, son. He was the kid. So there's this long pause. He said, that's me. And he was kind of proud of it. And I said, Mr. Patton, my name's John McLean. I'm writing a book about the rattlesnake fire, and I'd like to talk to you.
Okay.
That's what was going on. And he, long pause, and then this kind of giving in voice, okay, I'll talk to you. Like it was finally going to fall out of his head. And I said, fine, I'll be there in 15 minutes. And I was. And I got him on tape for an hour, and I got most of the story that I wanted. I had enough there. And we were at the end of the tape, and then I could ask the question.
Right.
I said, Stan, why are you talking to me?
Yeah. Why did you even agree to talk to me?
Because you never talked to anybody else before. Et
After
cetera,
all
et
these
cetera.
years.
After all these years. And he said, well, you said you were writing a book, and I wanted to get my side of it out. What I've been doing all along, I've been creating something in pieces that, combined with my father's book, Young Men and Fire, is without parallel in the nonfiction natural disaster literature.
Right.
It's multi-generational. It covers and recreates fires for over a century. If I finish the one I've got going on Yarnell Hill, it covers most of the big ones, not all.
But I do want to point out, as you said, with your dad's book, Norman McLean, Young Men and Fire, I think you made a very good point in some literature, some interviews recently or over time, that the difference between Fire on the Mountain, your first book, and Young Men and Fire, the difference, if you will, is of the same genre in terms of firefighters and lessons and the tragedies that occurred, but that he interjected himself into the book, how he may have seen these events. Tell me a little bit more about that.
Well, if you start out to write a book about a wildland fire, and your father wrote A River Runs Through It and Young Men and Fire, and everybody is in love with those things,
Sure.
you're going to have a problem, because everybody can compare what you're doing to what he did, and you better not try to imitate it.
That's a
My
good
father
point.
was a great stylist, but it is an inimitable style. So what I decided very early on was I would do two things. I would write the way I wrote, which was as a newspaper man, try to get it on steroids, take it up a couple of steps, put everything you got into it. But that secondly, I would leave myself out.
Well, and we touched on this earlier with your journalistic background and the approach, the stylistic approach to the 5 books you've written thus far and the 6th that you're working on. I wanted to go back again, if we could, just to highlight your 30 years with the Chicago Tribune. But explain the Kissinger 14. Give me a little bit more.
Oh, well, this, I guess you have to explain it to people now. For when it was going on, it was the biggest story in the world.
Right.
Henry Kissinger used to shuttle between the Israelis and the Arabs with side trips to Europe to report to the NATO allies, working on 2 agreements, Sinai 1 and Sinai 2, that got the Israelis and the Egyptians together. Never did come to include the Palestinians, and we're living with
Right.
that partial victory to this day. But we would fly back and forth, Jerusalem, Cairo, and so on, Damascus. And that became known as the Kissinger Shuttle. There were 14 seats for the press, and 12 of them were automatics. You had to have the Associated Press, UPI, ABC, NBC, etc. Then there were 2,
Open seats,
and
if you will.
sometimes only 1, that would be called open seats that would go to the best bidder. And I became very adept at making the case that you guys are bi-coastal. You're fixated on the West Coast and mostly on the East Coast, and you don't know anything about the middle of the country. And the only time you think about the Midwest is when you're flying over it on your way to LA. And it was a good argument. The Chicago Tribune is the big Midwestern newspaper.
Right.
And I got on most of the shuttles and most of the key shuttles. We had quite a time with Henry. He was a one-man show. Absolutely brilliant. The smartest people I've ever been around. Loved the press. Knew how to play us like a fiddle.
Being in the black is throughout your books. Describe that a bit.
In the black is a safety zone. You can run away from a fire, or you can run into a fire where it is already burned and achieve a relative degree of safety. There can be a reburn. I mean, there's stuff in fires, there's always sparing. But generally, if it's good black, if it's really been scorched, you can step into that. That's
And
why
be in a bit of
firefighters use the
protection.
phrase 1 foot in the black. So that if something unexpected happens, they've already got 1 foot in the black, they can put 2 in there and be in good shape.
And on that note, from a policy standpoint, you mentioned throughout your writing the policies, if you will, from 1910 forward on the let it burn or put out on site, if you will. Where are we in, I mean, when you look at 100 years, it appears with the Yellowstone 1988 fire, it appears that there's a bit of a, what's the policy now?
A roller coaster.
Exactly.
Yes, there was a hard-won policy enunciated in 1936, the 10 a.m. policy, that followed the 1910 fires. It took 25 years to get there. And the policy was that you would put out fires by 10 a.m. The morning after they were spotted, and if not then, by 10 a.m. the next morning. This became a full suppression policy. Today, that has broken down. It's very interesting how you get to that, because there was a lot of opposition to it at the time. They lost. The people who were for a let burn and this is a healthy thing for some forests, they lost. In the long run, they've won. That we must let some fires burn because it's healthy for the forest was one of the lessons of the 1988 Yellowstone fires. Remember that? The jewel in the crown of the National Park Service is being destroyed by fire. It will be scorched earth forever, and a day the far side of the moon. This is a horror. Then the reports came out afterwards, the thoughtful ones that said, you can't have a lodgepole forest renewed unless it burns. This is a natural process. In fact, the fire cycle in Yellowstone National Park is a very long one. It's almost 200 years because it's a high, wet bowl.
Well, I believe
and this is a great idea. You know, let's
Right.
let it burn because it's natural to the forest.
Right.
Well, as long as you're inside the national park, but there's an invisible boundary there where you suddenly wind up on national forests where all the rules are different, or on private land, or you're threatening a town. There's several right around Yellowstone Park, and then it all changes. So two things have made a huge difference in recent years. One is the expansion of the interface. More and more homes are out there where you face the same kind of decision.
Right.
Great that we're burning the chaparral. It's supposed to burn every 25 years. Oops, there are 1,000 homes that just got whacked.
Absolutely.
We should have put it out, or somebody should have put it out, or boy, that was too bad. And the other is climate change. The planet has been getting warmer for the last 10,000 years. If you don't believe that, this is the end of the glacier, or close to it. It was at Seeley Lake,
Yep.
and now it's not.
Yeah.
It got warmer.
Yeah, things change.
There are two points of that. One is that there's a hockey stick where the temperatures have been going up radically since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. How much did human activity contribute to that? I don't know, but the late Charlie Krauthammer, the great, very great conservative columnist and medical doctor, wrote about that. And he just didn't buy the mantra of the conservative movement that there is no climate change. He says, I'm a scientist. He says, we've been throwing junk up into the atmosphere for 125 years on an unprecedented scale. And if you believe that that has had no effect whatsoever, we're not talking on the same plane.
Right. We're not being rational.
We're not being rational. So I don't have an answer but to percentages. But I'll go with Charlie Krauthammer.
And the book you're looking at, or actually have spent significant time working on lately, is the Yarnell Fire. 2013, Granite Mountain hotshots. Tell me a little bit about the variables that played out in that particular fire.
Well, the variables in that fire were that 19 members of the Granite Mountain hotshots were killed. And you have to go back to 1910, more than a century before, to find a greater number of dedicated wildland firefighters being killed by fire on any incident. It was shocking to everyone. How could this happen? We've had the South Canyon fire, the 30-mile fire, the Rattlesnake fire. We have the 10 standard orders. This is never supposed to happen at this level.
Right.
But it did. And why did the superintendent, Eric Marsh, and 18 other men decide after 4 o'clock in the afternoon, in a time of drought with great heat, when they could see a fire below them in a valley, to leave a relatively safe, blackened or scorched area? So you got Eric Marsh and the hotshots walking along a ridgeline away from Good Black late in the afternoon, when they can see the fire and know that there's a thunderstorm coming behind it that is going to accelerate it. And they go down into a box canyon where they would have had no more than one lookout. It's not absolutely proved that they had Eric Marsh acting as lookout, but he probably was.
Right.
And the fire comes to the mouth of the box canyon, roars up, engulfs them, and kills them. Why did they leave? Why did they leave? And what was said right afterward was, well, we'll never know. And there's some truth in that. You're not going to know everything about what was said and the click, click, click mental processes of the time. But we know a lot. And the answer to it, how you deal with that, comes from Henry Kissinger, of all people.
Yeah.
Not your idea of a wildland firefighter. Not mine.
No,
either.
but a bright guy.
And yet, there was a new foreign affairs columnist for the Wall Street Journal who wondered how he was going to do it. And he called up Henry. And Kissinger said, I'll tell you what you have to do with foreign policy. You have to give context. Can't just take the things that happened in the last week. It's a weekly column, a very good one. You've got to put this thing in historical context, go back and expand it so that people can really understand why that
one
happened, what was
decision led to
working on them in the
another.
long
Right.
run, not just the things they said in the last seconds. Now, the Yarnell Hill fire, I think, is exactly the same. You have to go back in the life of the superintendent, Eric Marsh. You have to go back into the character of the Granite Mountain hotshots as a group. You have to deal with what happened the day before the fatalities, which nobody has dealt with. And then look at the situation outside of them, in addition to them, at 4 o'clock, 4:30 in the afternoon on that fire. And my point is that if you drop it right there, you are not getting full value out of 19 deaths.
Right. And lessons that can be learned.
There are many, many lessons to be taken here. And once you place this thing in context and understand the background and understand and have some empathy for the decision-making process that they went through, in fact, considerable empathy, and leave your opinions at home for a while, you will come up with things that will save lives in the future, which is a lot more important than you having a field day kicking around Eric Marsh.
Right. Well, you've had many answers for many families throughout the 3 decades, nearly 3 decades of writing about these catastrophic fires, the tragedies. Your new book is a great book. I've really enjoyed it. I'd recommend anybody to go out and buy it. But also excited about the forthcoming book for the Yarnell fire.
It's going to take several more years.
Yeah, Mr. McLean, absolute pleasure, and I really appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
Thanks for coming over.
The McLean legacy, the literary and personal history of the McLean family, is deeply embedded in Montana and the history of the U.S. Forest Service, the nation's dominant fire agency. Counting Norman McLean's Young Men and Fire, the classic account of the Man Gulch Fire of 1949, and the younger McLean's 5 books, with another in the works, father and son, have compiled a narrative series grounded in field research chronicling the great wildland fire tragedies of the modern era. There is nothing like it anywhere else in the literature of natural disasters. Both men took inspiration from their ties to Montana, which became their essential field station. The 2 most closely linked books, Young Men and Fire on the Mountain, describe the core of Forest Service fire history, and both are linked to Montana. Thank you for joining us on this special edition of Spokane Talks from Missoula, Montana, where we had a unique opportunity to sit down with award-winning author John McClain. Please join us next week for more news, views, and conversation.
Spokane Talks is about you. Give us your feedback and comments at info@SpokaneTalksMedia.com. We'll be back next week with additional news, views, and conversations. Please join us.